We're here today under the Chartered Bodies Alliance banner, which is a combination of the three chartered bodies. That's the Chartered Insurance Institute, the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investments, and the Chartered Bankers. Actually, it was their initiative today to put on this extremely good topic. And the Chartered Bodies Alliance is really all about actually helping professionalism. And we believe actually that the way to demonstrate professionalism is to belong to one of these chartered bodies and take our exams and become chartered. So that's the principle behind what we're doing today. Great to see so many people here today from all three institutes. And we've come actually to listen to two distinguished speakers. We're very fortunate that there's Hotfoot from New York this morning. Circling over here only an hour or two earlier is Antony Jenkins, founder of 10x Future Technologies and former CEO of Barclays. And he's here with his colleague, Emma Byrne. Now they're going to have probably a conversation, perhaps, rather than a lecture, and invites us all to contribute a little bit later on. So, can I ask you to turn off your mobile phones? If we do have a fire alarm, I'm afraid it's for real. And without further ado, let's go.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out this morning to discuss this fascinating topic. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Emma Byrne, who is an expert in artificial intelligence. And so she will be able to give you many more insights into how the technologies work and what some of the possibilities are around this. Your own experience, Emma, has been in healthcare, where you've done some terrific work on things like identifying stroke earlier and so on. So we'll talk about some of those use cases. But just for full disclosure, I am actually a chartered banker. I did my exams many years ago. I still remember doing them. Now, about 2.5 years ago, I gave a speech at Chatham House called Approaching the Uber Moment in Financial Services, by which I meant a time in which technology creates a point of transformation, just as it was able to create a point of transformation in transportation with Uber. And at the time, I made a prediction that said over the next decade, we'd see something like half the branches close and half the jobs go out of the industry. And at the time, that felt like quite a sort of punchy prediction to make. But reflecting on that speech 2.5 years later, I think we can already see at least two Uber moments, and there is a third that is definitely on the horizon. The first Uber moment is the astonishing adoption of mobile banking by consumers in this country. The adoption rates, if you plot it on a graph, the graph is almost vertical. And this, of course, has led to a consequent reduction in traffic inside branches, which has fallen by something like 40% in the last 2 or 3 years. And indeed, if you go into a bank branch now, there's usually more staff than customers in there because we all like to do things on our phones. And this really is an example of how, when technology creates an experience which is much better than doing it the traditional way, you get a big shift in customer behavior. The reason why we called the business 10x Future Technologies was because we want to build a set of capabilities that are at least 10 times better than doing it the old-fashioned way, and we believe if you can do that, then you get customer adoption, as we've seen with mobile. The second is the explosive growth in cryptocurrencies. Now, depending on what you feel about crypto, it's either the biggest scam of all time or it's the future of financial services. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But if you look at the scaling of the crypto industry, again, that's happened almost vertically. What's fascinating about these two things is that they are underpinned by really tectonic forces that are occurring within technology. And these forces are about the availability of vast amounts of super cheap computing power that allows you to run very complex computation at a cost-effective price point. And so when I think about what the third upcoming Uber moment is, I think this is going to be about data. But it's a complex topic because data is linked very closely to identity. If you think about it, data is useless without identity. Until you can establish the identity of an individual or an organization, data, which are basically attributes about that person or organization, are meaningless. So the creation of a valid digital identity And the collection and creation of data around that identity, I think, is going to become the next Uber moment, and not just in financial services. And what we're going to begin to see is the merging of financial services with other aspects of our lives, like healthcare, like education, like your professional life, so that your data and identity become a valuable living organism, which can be monetized for your benefit, not as happens today when we give our data freely across the digital world for other people's benefit. And the reason why artificial intelligence is particularly interesting in this context is that although what we now know as artificial intelligence has been around at least since the 70s, this availability of vast amounts of cheap computing power enables the provision of artificial intelligence services in a way which we could not have imagined before. So in this session, what Emma and I are going to cover is the following. Firstly, we're just going to do, and Emma's going to do, a sort of very brief sort of definitional setup piece on what AI is, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is. We'll then just talk through 2 or 3 use cases from financial services, and then we'll dive into what are some of the ethical issues that this provokes. Now, all new technologies throw up ethical issues. For those of you who are students of history, you'll recall that when cars were first invented, there used to be a person walking in front of the car with a flag to warn pedestrians that a dangerous vehicle was approaching. Now, that's clearly ludicrous from today's perspective, but in many ways, a lot of the debates about AI are the equivalent of putting somebody with a flag in front of a car. So, on the other hand, we have to accept that this ability to manage data in a way which hasn't been possible before is going to throw up a set of significant ethical issues that need to be thought through carefully. The one that is often quoted in the autonomous vehicle space is, do you save the driver or do you hit the child? How do you make that decision? How does the machine make that decision? So we'll explore some of these things, and we'll talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So, Emma, what is artificial intelligence?
Well, I'm going to confine myself to the kinds of artificial intelligence that are useful in the financial technology sector. There are a lot of books about things like the singularity, is a term you may have heard, or Nick Bostrom's superintelligence, this idea that we could develop in the next 5 or 10 years some kind of runaway superintelligence that is capable of setting its own priorities and inflating its own learning capability. That, speaking as somebody who's studied both actual human cognition and neuroscience and computer science, I started wanting to be Dr. Susan Calvin from Isaac Asimov's books. I really thought I was going to make human-style companions out of AI. And then I went to work in a neuroscience lab, and nothing tells you how much hubris you have when you draw on a whiteboard how you see the workings of the human brain, and the actual neuroscientists and cognitive scientists just sort of try not to laugh. And it's that realization that human and animal intelligence is so much more flexible and so much more integrated. It's an emergent property of a lot of very different parts of our understanding of the world that have learnt to work together over millions of years of evolution. So that kind of philosophical general intelligence, the deep mind aim of solving intelligence, I wasn't aware intelligence was a problem, but there you go, that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about it over coffee later, and I will go off on one, I'm just warning you. So the two that are mainly in use in industry in general, and have been used for a long time in medicine, and are really starting to be adopted in the financial services over the last 5 or 10 years, are natural language processing. And that's something we don't have to worry about too much from an ethical point of view. Natural language processing is usually just another way of interacting with a machine. Rather than typing commands as we did 30 years ago, or clicking on icons as we've done since the late 80s, early 90s, you can speak a string of natural language as if you were talking to a person, and the computer will parse that and try to meet whatever requirement it is that you've set it. There are a few ethical issues around that. For example, how long do you keep the recordings of what somebody's said? Should devices like Google Home be listening all the time or only when the key phrase is on? How long should you keep those recordings? But they are the kinds of issues we've had about keeping people's data for the last 20, 30 years. But deep learning, or the sort of large-scale neural networks that Antony was talking about, the things that are only possible because we now have essentially processing as a utility. Cloud computing means that, as Antony said, for an extremely competitive price point, and also something that is scalable by the moment. If I want to do something that requires thousands of GPUs in order to train over the next month, but after that I have no requirement for those GPUs at all. It used to be I'd have to go out and buy myself a server farm, which would cost me millions, and then find some way of decommissioning that economically. I don't have to do that anymore. I can dial up that through AWS, through Google Cloud, through other online computing, cloud computing providers, and say, I just need those long enough to train my model, then you can have them back. That utility model of computing has massively changed our ability to train neural network models. And the other thing is the availability of data. And as Antony said, the adoption for mobile banking has been practically vertical. When you look at the rates at which people have switched from in-bank or on phone to actually just pulling out your device and checking what your balance is, that is so much more convenient. And we have so much more data because of that. And as Antony pointed out, when you can tie behavior to an individual, that data suddenly has so much more value because we can do things that are personalizable. But that's when we start to get into those ethical issues. You know, how much personalization should we do? The other thing that we can do with that data is deal with it at scale. We do this a lot in the medical setting. If we're looking at things at scale, it's something called epidemiology. I'm not trying to diagnose your particular risk of heart failure, but I'm trying to work out what kinds of heart rates, what kind of heart rhythms, what kinds of diet, what kinds of exercise patterns might, in general, cause a higher risk. It becomes ethically questionable when I am able to look at everyone in this room with my facial recognition technology, go to the cloud, pull your medical record, and say, actually, I wouldn't lend money to you, you, and you, because you're probably not going to last the year. That's not the kind of thing any of us wants deep learning to do to us personally. And yet it's entirely possible. So deep learning is something that we're starting to figure out how to deploy. And GDPR has just arrived with its ability to respond to the collation and integration of massive amounts of data. But what it doesn't do, what I believe it doesn't do, although lawyers in the room, people with legal training in the room may be able to correct me on this, is that it doesn't do enough on automated processing. So deep learning is where we're going to go when we want things like a better understanding of somebody's insurance risk, or a better understanding of whether or not someone is a credit risk, or a better understanding of whether or not this transaction is fraudulent or not, or even a better understanding of when we are likely to need branches or where we're likely to need them. You know, being able to employ staff as Uber do, as Deliveroo do, hour by hour instead of day by day. But again, these come with not just ethical risks, but reputational risks that go with those things. So I would say don't worry about the singularity or superintelligence. Don't worry too much from an ethical point of view about natural language processing, although it does provide a huge opportunity from customer service fulfillment's point of view. But deep learning, where you're starting to look at using the data you have access to create predictions that then allow for some autonomous decision making by a system, that's where we really get into this contention between ethics and professionalism on the one hand, and this ability to harness new technologies to make services more scalable and more economically viable on the other hand. So should we talk a few use cases maybe?
Yeah, I think just because it sounds, all this AI stuff, it sounds really kind of, depending on whether you love it or hate it, it's really kind of exciting or it's totally terrifying. When Emma talks about the singularity, she means the point at which machines can basically outthink human beings. You may have heard of the Turing test, which is a test where if you were talking to, if there's a big screen there and you were talking to somebody, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a machine and a person. another way of thinking about that level of evolution. But I think what you're saying, Emma, is we're a long way from that.
Very long way from that. I mean, you will have possibly interacted with things like Siri or Google Home, which can have a very directed conversation that is to do with fulfilling a particular request. But if you wanted to talk to it about hopes, dreams, aspirations, plans, your latest business idea, it would have no clue. It doesn't have that embodied cognition, that understanding of what an ambition is, of what a hope is, what a dream is, what a plan is. And it's not all about emotion, but there's a lot of contextual, emotional, and creative thinking that we are doing in order to have this conversation that machines are a very long way away from.
So if we sort of pass this down into its components, you've got a data set and you've got a set of tools that allow you to analyze that data set and make predictions. Now, in financial services, of course, people have been doing that for decades. So what's the difference, if you like, between the sort of typical statistical model you'd use to predict credit loss or insurance risk and what you're talking about in deep learning, and maybe bring to life with a use case?
Sure. So it used to be, deep learning used to be called data mining, and data mining used to be a pejorative term. Anyone who has training in statistics will know that data mining was never considered to be a good thing. And yet when I was doing my doctorate, data mining was a whole part of the department I was working in. So it used to be, if you were an analyst, or even now, if you are an analyst, you would request the kind of data that you think will be relevant to the model that you're going to build. And you would do various analyses to look to see whether there are correlations, whether there are predictions that you can make. And you would use various well-known statistical tools and techniques to be able to put some boundaries on how confident you were in those predictions, for example. In machine learning, what we can do is feed in a whole load of unselected data, a vast swathe of data that you just could not combinatorially make models from. So one of our clients, Shane, has a thing that, and who knows, we may need inside leg measurement or we may need shoe size. And my argument for that is what you've got there is a proxy for gender. Because if shoe size is 7 or above, you can be fairly confident you're edging into male territory. If it's 4 or below, you're pretty certain that it's a woman. But we don't have to have these conversations beforehand as to what data may or may not be relevant. You can give it the data that you have collected and let the machine learning determine what are the principal components. So something called principal components analysis is a really powerful technique for telling you, actually, we didn't think that the number of times you've changed your job in the last 6 years had any relevance on whether or not you're a good insurance risk. Or if we did, our instinct might have been that someone who's that flighty is a terrible insurance risk. But actually, someone who changes their job every 6 months is phenomenally entrepreneurial and very, very healthy. They don't have concerns that make them sit and stay in this one place out of fear of moving. Maybe they're an excellent insurance risk. Our intuition would never have taken us there, but the machine learning models can derive correlations, can identify correlations that we did not go out looking for. What's more, they can identify much finer-grained correlations. So what we would be looking for when making statistical models is we try to divide people up into categories beforehand and then look for models that fit each of those categories. In the machine learning space, we can do something called clustering that allows us to look for people who are more like Antony, or people who are more like me, or people who are more like my husband. And we may have very, very different purchasing habits or driving habits, or likelihood of having got off a transatlantic flight at 6 a.m, depending on our different behaviours. So rather than trying to make a model that fits everyone, so going back to the the heart failure model, rather than just looking at everybody's BMI or everybody's hip to waist ratio, what we now integrate are things like your ethnic background, your genetic predisposition to certain illnesses. There are some ethnicities that are much more likely to have diabetes, but not likely to have a stroke. Others, the risk is different. So the way we would choose to advise people about how they should be taking exercise, what they should be doing about their diet, whether or not they should be on any sort of preventative of medicine differs according to who your parents were. We didn't know that 5-10 years ago. We really thought it was purely about your physiology, that you could observe through things like heart rate or waist-hip ratio. We now know that it requires much more information, and it's machine learning models that have allowed us to extract that bit of knowledge.
And one of the fascinating things that this takes you to is the stacking of different technologies. Now, autonomous vehicles, you can tell I'm fascinated by these, having spent hours in traffic yesterday. The one great things about autonomous vehicles is they drive more effectively than human beings, because you don't get that sort of telescoping effect where there's traffic. And they also, of course, have fewer road traffic accidents. But they require a combination of technologies to work. So they require radar, they require LiDAR, which is a laser version of radar. They also require 5G. So the reason why 5G is important is because it's a building block for autonomous vehicles, because you need to process and pass a lot of data. But in terms of what Emma was just describing, obviously, in order to be able to gather these other variables, the non-traditional variables, you need technologies that allow you to, identify those genetic markers very cheaply, and those technologies are also coming. So you get this stacking effect where, and we can sequence people's genomes very cheaply, take that data, apply these sort of algorithms to them, and come up with a set of conclusions about how successful they're going to be in life, what their healthcare situations are, what their predilection to social and other problems are. And this then takes you into the space of the ethical issues around artificial intelligence. And I'd like to just sort of shift onto that, if we may. And there's really three areas that we'd like to cover in this section. One is about bias. Now, bias is almost inevitable in anything that humans build. And certainly where there's an autonomy to the system, the bias can be reinforcing. So we'll explore bias and how to deal with bias. The second thing we'll talk about is what are the implications for these technologies when you get into a space that we regard as the sort of end of mutualization. So in the insurance business, if 10,000 people take out life insurance, some people will die young, some people will die old, but it sort of averages out. The insurance company makes a profit, everybody gets coverage. In a world where we can predict exactly when you're going to die, or within plus or minus 3 or 4 years, is it possible to even have that mutualized approach? And is that a good or a bad thing? And how do you deal with people who are excluded from the system? And then the third thing we'd like to touch on is the ethical implications for the nature of work. So let's start with bias. Emma, can you describe how bias kind of creeps in or can creep in, and what we can do to sort of protect against it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with using artificial intelligence is a cognitive issue called the automation bias. You may remember when GPS was first a thing and people were following the GPS navigation systems down ridiculous narrow pathways that were obviously not roads, but the computer had told them to. Now, as we get more used to particular technologies, our trust in them tends to drop off, which is a good thing, because these any system has limits on its competence and on its understanding. And one of the health warnings that particularly deep learning should come with is that it's only as good as the data set that you feed it. So, for example, if we were to, I have to say the chartered body here is considerably more representative than most of the technology bodies that I am involved with, but still, if I were to say, tell me what a banker looks like based on this room, it's not going to come up with an earth-shatteringly different picture. Sorry, I'm not having a go at you. I'm really sorry. I'm just saying it would basically be you, wouldn't it? Yeah. No offence. But that's one of the problems, is that how do you go from an extremely granular and very different and diverse set of data to a single conclusion? So anything that is designed to give you a simple yes, no, do this, do that, this person's a risk, this person isn't a risk, is taking what is an enormously complex set of variables and reducing it to a binary, which means that you are going to get bias effects. So one of the most famous ones, and to be honest, AI is a force multiplier. Any technology is a force multiplier. The flash crash of 2010 was essentially high-frequency trading that had spotted a dodgy signal from an actual human who was trying to do something terrible. But between them, high-frequency trading algorithms placed 27,000 purchases in sell orders in 12 seconds, which tanked the market. If you train something badly so that when it recognizes a signal, it says, this is a terrible thing, I'm going into panic mode, then it will multiply that. The other example is something called PredPol, the predictive policing system that was, I can't remember which university it was in the United States, but I still do not understand why nobody at design stage realized that what we were creating was a feedback, or what they were creating was a feedback loop, which was, let's look at where this police force makes the most arrests. Let's assume that that's where most of the crime is. And let's put this into the system and say, at these times of day, in these postcodes, this is most likely to be somewhere where we'd be making an arrest. So let's send more police officers there. And let's allow this to keep learning as we've deployed it as to where the arrests are now. Because we don't want it to just, be trained up until the 15th of August, and then in December it's doing arrests somewhere different. But lo and behold, already areas that were particularly black American areas, were over-policed. More minor crimes were reported in those areas than in white areas, traffic violations, stop and searches. And so they were going, well, we need more police officers in this area. So you deploy more police officers to that area, so you get more stop and searches and more minor traffic crimes. Meanwhile, the more affluent, more white areas had less policing, and so less crime was being reported. And within about 4 weeks of this system being deployed, all of the police officers were concentrated, basically had one per black person in the city and nobody in the white. It was shocking. You see the same thing with the systems that look at how likely it is that somebody is going to violate their parole, which were deployed in the UK and rapidly shut down because the Oxford Internet Institute looked at this and said, if I put in an entirely fictitious person whose postcode is in an area that is more likely to have black and minority ethnic residents, or whose name is more likely to belong to someone who is black or minority ethnic, this is still more likely, given everything else is the same, to say that this person will violate their parole and to say that they should not be released on parole. This is utterly shocking. No one has looked in this black box and said, how are you making your decisions? Which is why I am extremely, kind of getting onto the ethics now, I'm extremely keen that all data-driven systems should come with an information sheet, a data sheet, like a physical piece of hardware, that should say exactly what it was trained on. And if the elements that are making these predictions involve people's names and people's postcodes, we have to be able to look at that and go, what is that a proxy variable for? Because somebody's name does not, in and of itself, tell you whether or not they're going to violate parole. It may indicate what ethnic group they belong to or what gender they are. It may be that the system already has bias. It is already refusing parole to certain types of people. The system will just continue to exercise that bias, but with this double effect of it being both a force multiplier, it can enforce bias on an industrial scale, 27,000 decisions in 12 seconds, and that it does it in such a way that people are not yet confident to question whether or not the system is wrong. And the system is likely, in edge cases, to be wrong. So that's something that not only ethically but professionally we need to be aware of about these systems.
So bias can exist in the data set itself, because obviously any data set is backward looking. If you looked at a data set of senior executives in financial institutions, it would be overwhelmingly male. So if that was your proxy for what good looked like, you could continue to reinforce that skew. But also in the algorithms and the deep learning itself, there can be biases. So being clear about what the data set is, being clear about how the deep learning works is really how you can overcome and police and look for the bias in the data set.
Yeah, and this is something that worries me a little bit about the availability of machine learning tools to non-specialist, non-trained users. It sort of goes back to when statistics is used by people who aren't statisticians and they believe that they found a fantastic correlation, but they have no understanding of confidence intervals. So one of the really important things you do when you're training one of these systems is to decide what the fitness function is going to be. What is it that you're actually training for? Are you trying to maximize the number of people you give loans to? Does this then lead to something called counterfeit positive, which is, it's not the same as a false positive, but it looks really good to the system that it's giving as many loans as possible to as many people. Are we trying to minimize defaults, in which case the system's probably going to go, well, then I just won't give any loans at all. So somehow you have to create a balance between these things. And in financial services, you have something called a risk appetite, which allows you to basically put numbers on some of these things. But if you're not looking at how those decisions are made and how you've asked it to make those decisions, for example, am I going to turn down people who are really on the borderline? Am I more likely to put someone on the borderline if they're from this ethnic group or from this, even just things like I assume one would never really think about someone's sexuality when giving a loan. However, if we're just throwing in a bunch of data into deep learning, we have no idea if it's saying actually the title, if your title of your spouse is the same as your title, we've decided you're more loanable than if you're not. And it may be a minor fluctuation in the training data that does not represent any kind of underlying reality, but it will end up shifting what the outcome is. So the only thing that we can do is open up that black box. And the way that we do that is not by looking at the network weights themselves. Those are inscrutable. But what you can do is something called LIME, locally interpretable machine explanations. And what you do is you take, for example, imagine it's hiring someone for a job, and you take thousands of almost identical CVs, but you vary characteristics systematically, particularly things that are in GDPR as whatever it's called now, that it's not sensitive information, but personally identifying information, like gender, like sexuality, like date of birth. And you can look to see where you have sudden discontinuities, that 50 of these CVs all had exactly the same experience, but half of them were male, half of them were female. The male ones were much more likely to be hired than the female ones. You know your system has a problem. So that kind of post hoc checking, once the model is trained and before it is deployed, it's not mandatory, but it's certainly professional. It's certainly something we should be looking at doing.
And I think what you can tell from Emma's comments is this is a highly technical area, a combination of neuroscience, statistics, technology, all of those things coming together, that has to be used with great care if we're going to avoid unethical outcomes. And shifting to the second area that we mentioned, which is in a business like credit card, which I'm deeply familiar with, the business model is basically predicated on accurately forecasting your credit losses. And those credit losses are ascribed to cohorts of people, often thousands or tens of thousands of people that sort of look the same. But of course, the false positives are very dangerous because you can end up lending money to people that you shouldn't, or who can't afford it, or you can end up not lending enough money to people who can afford it. And so there's every possibility with these tools that we can begin to reduce the amount of false positives, and also critically introduce automation into that process so we can reduce the cost of it, which means on the margin that we can serve more customers. All of these things are, at least on the face of it, positives. Clearly, it's not good to lend money to somebody who can't afford to pay you back. Clearly, it's not good for somebody not to get as much credit as they can sustain. But if we move away from a world of mutualization, whether it's in insurance or in credit, how do we deal with the people who are excluded from the system? And does the fact that some are excluded more than justify the fact that some people will be included who were previously excluded from the system? So there are no, like many ethical questions, there are no right and wrong answers to this, but there are a set of questions that we have to reflect on. And I'm just wondering whether, how the academic world has thought about these topics and whether there's any insight for us there.
I mean, that was one of the glorious things about being an academic when I was just in theoretical research, was that temptation to sort of go, well, it's all right, because what I'm doing is so staggeringly impractical anyway that it doesn't matter. But over the last sort of 20 years of moving more and more towards AI that is deployed, that is working, doing things that people really need it to do, whether it's diagnosing the likelihood of stroke or ensuring that they get the kind of insurance or credit that they need and are capable of affording. And so it's not good enough for me anymore to sort of go, well, I'll build it, someone else can decide whether or not we should use it. But unlike the first of the ethical issues where we're looking at bias, where decisions are made wrongly, this is our ethical and professional responsibility when decisions are made correctly. As an insurer, are you beholden to insuring people who are a terrible risk? Obviously not. So what do we do as a society? And so one of the things I've become more active in doing, and in our own sort of chartered bodies and things like the British Computer Society and the Oxford Internet Institute, which is broadening its remit, is starting to actually educate policymakers and campaigning groups and chartered bodies like these, because these are, as Antony said, incredibly thorny issues. When the systems work well, they will change the way that we work. When the systems work well, they will change our contractual relationship with our customers. And so I don't have an easy answer to that. It depends on the kind of society you want to live in. I know what kind of society I want to live in, and that's where the democratic process, I think, really comes in, is everybody having an informed input into that decision making. What replaces GDPR in 5-10 years? What do we have in the meantime in our own legislative or even just professional standards that ensure that we are living in the kind of world we've decided that we want to live in? Because mutualisation will end as predictions become more accurate.
And we're covering a huge swathe of ground here. I do want to leave some time for Q&A. So I just want to make a closing comment from us on the impact on jobs, because in many ways what we just talked about and the impact in jobs is what economists call an externality. It's an impact which is not directly ascribable to a set of business actions. And typically the way externalities are dealt with is through taxes or subsidies. So the state imposes taxes or subsidies to neutralise the effect of that externality. And one of the things that is clear to me, frankly, and it goes back to the predictions that I made in the Uber Moment speech, is that what we're going to be able to see with even the near-term capabilities that we've been talking about today is the automation of vast amounts of sort of work in the middle skill spectrum. So this is either going to be through the automation of things like customer service. Natural language processing allows that. But equally, things like teaching, where the use of AI will allow a teacher to move from being a content specialist to being more of a coach, but could probably do it for 60 children in a class as opposed to 20 or 30 today. In the medical space, where we're seeing things like radiography, and the use of AI to give a first pass view of what the X-ray looks like, and then a human being can come by and provide further review and insight to that. So for me at least, and I think, Emma, you agree with this, we're not predicting that humans become irrelevant. Far from it. In fact, the sort of creativity, the entrepreneurialism, the collaboration, which sort of an inventiveness that sort of characterises the human species and why we've been able to evolve to the point we have is still going to be highly relevant. But we are going to see profound changes in the nature of work, and how we deal with that is also going to be an ethical issue, because we need our citizens to be economically productive, particularly as they're living longer. I think, in conclusion from us, whether you're an expert in AI, as Emma is, or a business person who thinks a lot about how technology is changing the world, as I do, I think broadly speaking, we feel positive about the future, but we also recognise that it is going to be hugely disruptive as these technologies season, as they combine with other technologies, as we were talking about, and really create some profound transformation in our lives, not just financially, but in our lives in total. So let's have some questions.
Shouldn't machine learning, which at the end of the day nothing more than a correlation machine, come with serious warnings? Because it's, as I understand it, with my limited knowledge of AI, it's nothing more than very sophisticated statistical and algorithmic matching. So the term AI to describe deep mining or machine learning or even neural network is somewhat limited. And if I was, ever applying AI in a business of mine, I would have it learn for a very long time because it needs huge amount of data. The cases that you cited had gone wrong because they'd been deployed far too prematurely. If they'd been allowed to gather a lot of data and learn and then be used, it would have been probably better. So,
are you talking about the high frequency trading or the predictive policing ones?
The police one particularly.
Yeah, I mean, that had used sort of 40, 50 years of data. And that's the problem, is that police forces in the United States have been, not to put too fine a point on it, racist for 40 or 50 years. Oh God, I hope this is not Chatham House rule at all, is it? It's all right, I don't plan to go to the United States anytime soon. Sorry. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You don't need to train them for 40, 50 years if you've got 40, 50 years of data. That's the great thing about why it's taken off much more quickly in medicine, and particularly in the UK, is that we have a spectacular... Has anyone here worked in general practice? There's a thing called read codes. If anyone knows a GP, ask them about read codes and watch their brains explode. But it's terrific. It was a chap by the name of Reed, I can't remember his first name, decided that we were going to code up medical records before they were even going to be machine readable. This goes back to those brown paper files, but there were codes for everything. I kid you not, when I was working on learning from medical records, there's one read code that I know for sure has never been used, which is head trauma from uncontrolled descent of space vehicle. It was added to the read codes when there's an RAF landing strip somewhere in the Midlands that is long enough for the shuttle to have made an uncontrolled descent on if it had a problem. And so that read code was added just in case the GP near that landing strip had to deal with head trauma. There are different read codes for whether or not you've been kicked in the head by a horse or whether or not you've fallen off a horse, and they come in different parts of the taxonomy. Now, this is a glorious set of data in theory for data mining. The problem is that most GPs just put things like throat pain not otherwise specified, chest pain not otherwise specified. So in the UK we have the richest data set possible, but it is not consistent. That data has been collected by humans. I think where we'll see a change in terms of data quality is we'll see that data is not only processed by machine, but it is collected by machine, so it is collected consistently. The problem is that it is then collected without nuance. It is collected by definition unprofessionally. There are things that GPs choose to exclude from medical records because they know that this is a transient issue that the person is speaking to them about. So there's something called QOF, the Qualities and Outcomes Framework, where if I'm a GP, I get paid. If you come in and I say, do you smoke? And if you smoke, GPs don't talk like that. Do you smoke? And if you confess to smoking even a little bit, they have to give you smoking cessation advice, or they lose about £1.20 per patient they don't give smoking cessation advice to. So an awful lot of GPs, you'll find just, if you come in going, you're sobbing, you go, my arm's falling off and my life's falling apart, my husband's leaving me and everything's terrible, they're meant to say, some point during that consultation, do you smoke? Most of them just tick, no, they don't smoke. So some of this data is lousy, but it's lousy because someone's exercised professional judgment. And again, what kind of society do we want to live in? One in which your data is incredibly accurate, but your interactions with your GP are terrible, or one in which your interaction with your GP is understanding, compassionate, professional, creative, empathetic, but maybe some of your data goes unrecorded. So that, I think, is where the problems are most likely to continue to arise. It's not that there'll be a lack of data, it's that data is not always value neutral. And even things like, what's their inside leg measurement? Man, you're collecting data about people's gender. You don't know it, but you are. So those are the things, I think, rather than how long we've been collecting the data, much more cogent is how we go about collecting that data and what we collect it for.
And I think the important thing about this is, with the computing power available to us, the ability to cleanse that data, or at least get it to a point where it's workable, is much greater now than it's ever been. And I go back to my autonomous vehicles argument. If the best thinkers on autonomous vehicles 8 years ago did not think we'd see them in our lifetime, and now we're talking about having them in the early 2020s because the computing capability is changing so quickly.
It started with something called the DARPA Grand Challenge, which was to try to get a military vehicle in an open desert to go anywhere. The first one, it's like, we're going to be fairly kind to you. We're going to say a 20-mile course. You've got all afternoon to do it. The longest distance one in the first competition went about 800 yards, and that was in an empty desert. And this is when I was doing my PhD, and the guy who managed to do the best DARPA Grand Challenge vehicle in about 2009 went off to work for Google in their autonomous vehicle department, a guy called Sebastian Thrun. And he basically took one look at the DARPA Grand Challenge and went, you're trying to solve the wrong problem. You're in a featureless desert. I know nothing about a featureless desert. It's great for the army, but if I want an autonomous vehicle on a road, I know there's a road. I have certain things I can assume about what the markings mean and what the surface properties are. And actually, to some extent, the data richness of cities, as Antony said, just even having 5G and a really good map that's tied to your GPS sensors and LiDAR that you can bounce off people and buildings, a technique called simultaneous localization and mapping, or SLAM, is really, really much easier in cities because so much is going on. So it's another example of where we as abstract academics have got the question wrong. We thought it would be easier in a desert. Turns out it's actually easier in a city.
Right, other questions? We're going to do a quick fire round now. So the lady here in the front.
I just wondered where artificial intelligence fits within the senior management and certification regime. So what happens?
That's a good question.
So the focus there is on culture, individual responsibility and accountability. So when this all goes horribly wrong, who's responsible? Because we don't have heads of IT typically on the board, and most CEOs of banks don't have PhDs in artificial intelligence.
I don't know, but I'd love to talk more about it. I really would.
Well, I do.
Yeah.
So, obviously, this is like any capability that the business employs. It's the responsibility of the leadership of the business to employ it in a way that is ethical, consistent with their values, consistent with their stakeholder requirements. And it's upon senior leaders to take the time to understand these capabilities and what their flaws are. It's just not good enough. I know you're not suggesting this, but I don't think it's good enough to say, oh well, I'm not somebody like Emma. I don't understand all of this. People don't understand how electricity works, but they're still responsible for health and safety in the building, and it's exactly the same thing. So as these techniques get deployed more into businesses, it's incumbent upon all senior leaders and in fact leaders to have a working understanding of them.
But I respectfully agree with my CEO, but...
But it sounds like you're respectfly disagreeing in a really polite way.
In a really polite way.
A machine couldn't do that. You just say,
exactly.
Just say you're wrong.
So, for example, sorry, what was your name, madam? Liz. So Liz can go back and go, all right, I know that there is something called a PAT testing regime that means that all of this kit has been tested by someone, and there's a sticker on it saying how long I can plug it into the wall for before someone has to come around with a multimeter and check that it's safe and isn't going to short out and kill someone. And that has been developed over a long time, and you have to get certification to be a PAT tester, to come along with your little multimeter and go, yep, that looks fine to plug in for another 6 months. We don't have one of those for AI yet. So I think yes, I agree, it's not good enough for senior managers to go, well, I don't know, in the same way as when I was an academic, going, I don't know, it's possibly unethical, I don't know, I just do the numbers. We have to come together on these things, but part of that will be the development of something like a PAT testing regime for this sort of technology. And I don't know what that looks like yet, but yeah, let's make one.
Right. Next question, sir.
Hi. I should say my name's Rob Dickey. I'm the president of the Chartered Banker Institute, and again a former Chief Technology and Information Officer for insurance companies and banks. The Chartered Banker Institute, we're actually beginning to adapt many of our educational offerings to embrace technology, so that emerging future bankers actually get exposed to technology, working with technologists in the British Computer Society and a range of others. In the next 5 to 10 years, for many of the people in this room from insurance companies and banks, it's a very broad subject, technology. What would you see as the kind of key skills? Because there's a great book called No Ordinary Disruption, which is a fabulous book by Richard Dobbs, and he says they don't need to know how to code, but they do have to understand the implications of technology for the operation of their bank to ensure, because they are accountable for it. What would you see as the core skills that over the next 5 to 10 years people in this room should really focus on?
It's a really good question. I think a lot of it is incumbent on us, the developers, and it's great that you're working with the BCS, because it's going to have to become part of our professional identity to be able to provide transparent information about the working of things that we've previously just been able to sell by going, it's a black box, but it's a very clever black box. I think the biggest skill from the point of view of this Chartered Association is to be able to know when someone is trying to do the sort of hand waving. How do you spot something that is bunkum at best or terrifyingly dangerous or unethical at worst, short of looking at whether or not someone has Cambridge Analytica on their CV? I swear they've tanked, because everyone I know has had calls from scalpers last month going, Cambridge Analytica are hiring. And we've all gone, yeah, no. So I think they've closed, not because they're trying to avoid the regulator, or not solely because they're trying to avoid the regulators, because they don't have anyone working for them anymore. Because I don't think most of us want to do things that are unethical or harmful. So some of those skills are, how do we have that conversation where we can be transparent and explain the technologies, and you guys know your regulatory landscape and your professional values, and so we can have this meeting in the middle. And some of that skills is how we figure out how to communicate the technology side of things in a way that is sufficiently transparent. And some of that is, I guess, being a technologist, like first to start by gathering your requirements. What are your professional? Anthony, what's?
Yeah, I mean, my simple answer for non-technical people, and I honestly think, learning to code is a complete waste of time, because most coding is going to be automated in the next 5 to 10 years anyway. And although I was encouraged in some ways that coding was introduced into primary schools, they are using the same program my daughter used when she was that age, and she's almost 30. But actually, the most important thing in this space is curiosity for non-technical people. You have to really take the time to look at what is happening with the underlying technologies. You don't need to, you don't need to spend a month in Silicon Valley or anything like that. But if you just read a bit, talk to a few people, and just see how much computing power is going to be available and what that can do, that's enough to get anybody's mind thinking about it. And from there, you can go in whatever direction is professionally helpful to you.
Get a buddy in the BCS.
I think we have time for one more question. So yes, please.
What can we do as professional bodies to improve the standards in the outcomes from AI? I was really intrigued by something you mentioned earlier about LIME. I didn't quite catch the last two letters in that, but enabling us to improve the transparency of, or some way of engaging in what's going on in that black box, because that's the bit where you've got on one hand humans making professional decisions, the other extreme a machine making decisions that you can't interact with. How can we help get more involved in or set standards or direction of that, which is otherwise invisible and impossible to engage with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the last two letters are machine something explanation, machine learning explanation possibly. And what it is it's kind of like X-ray crystallography for black boxes. That may or may not have made that easier. So X-ray crystallography is the idea that you can blast X-rays through something at various different angles, and by looking at the interference patterns, you know what the internal structure looks like. This is the same thing but with data, not X-rays. So it's like I mentioned earlier, this idea of you would say it's a recruiting tool, you would blast it with thousands of automatically generated CVs that vary along pre-specified axes. So the obvious ones are the ones that we have responsibilities under GDPR to be extremely sensitive to. Make sure that that the system hasn't accidentally learnt to spot trade union members, for example, and go, don't hire them, they're troublemakers. She says, speaking as a long-term trade union member. So, as an academic, we like striking. Gives you a chance to catch up on actually doing research instead of teaching and admin. God, please let this be Chatham House rule.
But I think the point is, conceptually what you do is you're varying the inputs to see how it affects the outputs.
Absolutely.
Right? And you're simulating a set of inputs, which may or may not happen in reality, but you know if they did what the outputs would be. And so it allows you to understand better how the algorithms inside the black box work. And it's back to Liz's question, which is exactly the right question. At the end of the day, we're all, if you're going to use a chainsaw, you don't have to understand how the motor inside it works, but you better understand it can chop your arm off.
Yeah.
And so it's incumbent upon all of us to, I think, begin to get familiar with these tools and techniques. I sense we could have spent probably all day on this topic. I hope this has been useful to you in some way. At 10X, the reason why Emma and her colleagues work with us is because we're using a lot of these techniques in various different ways as we build the next generation of banking. But we are highly confident that these tools are much more of a positive than a negative, but like chainsaws, they have to be used carefully. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my very great pleasure on behalf of the Chartered Bodies Alliance to thank Antony and Emma for a fascinating insight. You talked about deep learning. There's been a huge amount of deep learning that I think we, as the insurance, the finance, the banking professions, have managed to gain from you both this morning. We really appreciate the time you've taken to be with us, but in particular the insights you've shared with us. I think if I was to take 3 or 4 things away, one is the importance of learning from other professions. You gave some great examples from the medical profession, from sort of law enforcement here and in the US. For me, I would take away the need for professionals to train and explain, training the machines and being able to explain to other professionals and particularly to colleagues, customers and regulators. A need for professionals to have an understanding of technology, statistics, neuroscience. I would add banking and finance to that as well. That's absolutely key. We cannot lose the professional core on which our industry is built. The need for individuals and machines to follow professional standards. It's critical. The need for professional judgment still within the industry. Machines cannot deploy professional judgment. When we're looking at these ethical questions, individuals have to sit behind and be accountable for those decisions. And really importantly, the need to be curious. And I think that's helping individuals to maintain that curiosity, give them resources with which to understand the rapidly changing environment. That's the role of the bodies that form the Chartered Body Alliance, and please come to our future events when some of that curiosity, we hope, will be satisfied. So, Antony, Emma, thank you once more for spending the time with us. Please show your appreciation and enjoy the rest of the day.